building a life together, raising kids, paying bills, navigating the highs and lows. And then one day you wake up, look at the person next to you and think, I can't stand him. What happened? How did the man you once loved become the man you barely tolerate? Here's the truth. It's not just about him. It's about the years of unspoken resentment, the emotional neglect, the feeling of being unseen. And if we don't talk about it, really talk about it, it only gets worse. So today, we're breaking it down. Why does this happen? What's really going on behind closed doors? And most importantly, what can you do about it before it's too late? Let's get into it. The silent resentment that builds over the years in a marriage is rarely the result of one big moment. It's the accumulation of countless small ones. It starts with something simple. He forgets an important date, dismisses a concern, or doesn't notice the effort put into something. In the beginning, you brush it off. He's busy, you tell yourself. It's not a big deal. But over time, these little dismissals add up, layering over one another until they become something heavier, something that sits between you like an invisible wall. Resentment is tricky because it often goes unspoken. Many women in long-term marriages don't openly express their frustrations, not because they don't feel them, but because they've learned through years of experience that speaking up doesn't always lead to change. Maybe in the past they tried to explain their needs and were met with defensiveness or indifference. Maybe they felt unheard or even dismissed as being overly emotional. Eventually, they stopped trying. They swallowed their disappointments, choosing silence over another argument that leads nowhere. But just because something isn't said doesn't mean it disappears. In fact, it does the opposite. It festers. Resentment grows strongest in the spaces where communication weakens. When partners stop truly listening to each other. When "how was your day" becomes a habit rather than genuine curiosity. When intimacy shifts from deep connection to routine interaction or disappears altogether, the emotional distance widens. Women, especially, often bear the weight of emotional labor in relationships. They remember the small things, they anticipate needs, they nurture the bond. But when that effort isn't reciprocated, or worse, isn't even acknowledged, it feels like a betrayal of the partnership they believed in. What makes resentment so dangerous is that it doesn't just affect how you feel about your partner. It changes how you see them. The man who once made you laugh now irritates you with his jokes. The small habits that used to be endearing now feel like personal attacks. You start noticing every little thing he does wrong, and even neutral actions take on a negative tint. Over time, the version of him that exists in your mind becomes someone who doesn't care, doesn't try, doesn't see you anymore. And once that narrative sets in, it's hard to undo. The worst part? Most men don't even realize it's happening. To them, things might seem fine. They assume that because there aren't explosive fights, everything is okay. They don't notice the way their wife's tone has changed, how the warmth in her voice has faded. They don't recognize that the quiet moments aren't peaceful, they're heavy. And when resentment reaches a breaking point, it can come as a complete shock to them. By the time many women start openly expressing their dissatisfaction in old age, it's not because they just started feeling this way. It's because they've been holding it in for decades. The patience they once had is gone. The hope that things will change has faded. They've spent years putting their own needs second, prioritizing the family, the household, the relationship itself over their own happiness. But as they get older, as the distractions of work and raising kids fade away, they're left with the undeniable truth. They're unhappy, and they don't want to spend the rest of their lives feeling this way. Resentment isn't inevitable, but it is a natural consequence of neglect, emotional neglect, mental neglect, and even self-neglect. It thrives in silence, in unresolved issues, in the spaces where love was supposed to be nurtured but was instead left to wither. And the most painful realization? It could have been avoided if both partners had truly seen each other, truly listened, truly cared enough to address the small things before they became too big to fix. Emotional neglect in a long-term marriage is rarely intentional. It doesn't happen overnight, and often neither partner realizes it's even occurring until the damage has already been done. In the early years of a relationship, there's an excitement, an urgency to connect. You ask each other questions, you share your thoughts and feelings, you make an effort to understand one another on a deep level. But as time passes, routines take over, responsibilities pile up, and the emotional connection that once felt effortless starts to fade. What was once a partnership built on emotional intimacy slowly turns into two people merely coexisting under the same roof. One of the most painful aspects of emotional neglect is that it's not about outright mistreatment. It's not yelling, arguing, or intentionally hurting one another. It's the quiet erosion of connection. It's the way conversations become purely functional, discussing bills, schedules, or logistics rather than dreams, fears, or personal struggles. It's when "how are you" turns into a formality rather than a genuine question. It's when one partner stops noticing the other's emotional needs, assuming that because nothing is being said, everything must be fine. But silence is not the absence of a problem. More often than not, it's a sign of resignation, a sign that someone has stopped expecting to be heard. For many women, emotional neglect becomes most apparent in moments when they realize they no longer feel truly seen by their husband. The things they once shared eagerly are now kept to themselves, not because they don't want to talk, but because they feel there's no point. When they try to express frustration, stress, or sadness, they're met with indifference, problem solving, or even dismissal. Rather than feeling comforted, they feel alone, like their emotions are a burden rather than something to be understood. And over time, this changes the way they relate to their partner. There's a loneliness that exists within emotional neglect, even when you're not physically alone. It's the loneliness of sitting next to someone and feeling a million miles apart. It's the loneliness of knowing your partner is present but not really there. And the longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to bridge the gap. A woman who once turned to her husband for emotional support now turns inward, learning to deal with her struggles on her own. She stops sharing as much, stops expecting emotional validation, stops reaching out for comfort, and the more she pulls away, the less her husband notices, because to him, everything looks the same on the surface. The most tragic part of emotional neglect is that it often isn't malicious. Many men don't realize they're neglecting their wives emotionally because they equate love with providing, with being physically present, with staying committed. They assume that as long as they're not hurting their partner, as long as they're still showing up in the practical aspects of the marriage, everything is fine. They don't understand that emotional presence, actively listening, showing empathy, making an effort to connect is just as important as financial stability or shared responsibilities. By the time a woman begins to resent her husband for emotional neglect, it's rarely about one single moment. It's about years of feeling unheard, unseen, and emotionally unfulfilled. It's about the countless times she needed comfort and didn't receive it, the times she wanted to be understood but was met with indifference. And when she finally reaches the point where she feels more at peace alone than in his presence, the marriage is no longer a source of support, it's a source of exhaustion. In old age, this reality becomes even more apparent. With children grown and careers winding down, couples are left with only each other. And for many women, this is when they realize just how deep the emotional distance has become. The distractions that once masked the lack of emotional connection are gone, leaving them face to face with a person who feels like a stranger. At this stage, resentment turns into frustration turns into bitterness, and bitterness turns into a realization this is not the life they wanted to live. Emotional neglect is not always loud or dramatic. It's often quiet, unnoticed, and gradual, but its effects are just as devastating as any other form of neglect. Because at the core of every lasting marriage is one fundamental need: to feel loved, valued, and understood. And when that need is ignored for too long, what remains is not love, but a hollow shell of what once was. As people grow older, they change. The person you were at is not the same person you are at, or life experiences, struggles, personal reflections, and evolving priorities shape who you become. In a marriage, this process of change doesn't always happen in sync. What starts as a shared vision for the future can gradually diverge as each person develops in their own way. The challenge is that many couples don't realize this shift is happening until they feel like they're living with someone they no longer fully understand. At the start of a relationship, there's often a strong sense of alignment. Both partners are working towards similar goals, building a home, raising children, advancing in their careers. These shared responsibilities create a sense of unity, a feeling that they are moving through life together. But as time passes and circumstances change, individuals begin to develop their own interests, beliefs, and desires that may not always align with their partners. A woman who once devoted herself entirely to her family might rediscover passions she set aside. She might develop new opinions, explore different social circles, or seek personal growth that her husband does not share or even recognize. This change can create a gap in the relationship, one that grows wider if it's not acknowledged and addressed. If a woman starts to feel that her husband no longer understands who she is, or worse, that he doesn't care to, resentment can take root. It's not that she intentionally pulled away, it's that she evolved while he remained the same. And if he fails to see or appreciate this new version of her, she starts to feel invisible. Another source of distance in long-term relationships is the difference in how men and women experience aging. Many women go through profound emotional and psychological changes as they get older. They begin to reflect on their lives, questioning what they've given versus what they've received. They evaluate their happiness and consider whether they are truly fulfilled in their marriage. For some, this period brings a newfound sense of independence and self-awareness. They become less willing to tolerate neglect, indifference, or stagnation. They no longer want to suppress their needs for the sake of keeping the peace. Meanwhile, some men experience aging differently. Many become set in their ways, comfortable with the life they've built, and unwilling to change. If a woman begins to push for deeper emotional conversations, personal growth, or a different dynamic in the relationship, she may be met with resistance. Her husband may not understand why she suddenly seems dissatisfied with the way things have always been. From his perspective, nothing is wrong, but from hers, everything feels different. This mismatch in personal growth can create frustration on both sides. The woman feels trapped in a relationship that no longer fulfills her, while the man feels confused by her growing discontent. If this disconnect isn't addressed, it leads to a painful emotional divide. She may stop trying to engage in meaningful conversations, choosing instead to keep her thoughts to herself. She may stop expecting him to understand her, resigning herself to a quiet dissatisfaction. And when she realizes that the person she's become is no longer compatible with the person he is, she begins to detach emotionally. One of the biggest struggles in long-term relationships is the assumption that love alone is enough to sustain a marriage. But love without growth, without adaptation, without effort to evolve together is not enough. If a couple does not actively work to stay connected through each stage of life, they risk becoming strangers. A woman who once felt deeply connected to her husband may find that she no longer relates to him at all. And when she reaches that realization, love often turns into resentment, not because she stopped caring, but because she feels like she's outgrown a relationship that refuses to grow with her. In old age, when the distractions of work and family have faded, this emotional divide becomes impossible to ignore. With more time to reflect, many women confront the truth they've avoided for years. They are no longer the same person they were when they got married, and neither is their husband. The difference is she has changed and evolved while he has stayed the same. And that realization can be devastating. A marriage that does not grow together will eventually grow apart. The key is not just loving each other, but continuing to understand, respect, and adapt to each other's evolving identities. Without that effort, what remains is not a partnership, but two people living parallel lives, bound by history, but separated by who they've become. Unmet expectations are one of the biggest sources of resentment in long-term marriages. When two people get married, they often have a vision of what their life together will look like. They imagine a future filled with love, partnership, and support. They believe in the idea of growing old together, sharing experiences, and deepening their emotional bond over time. But as the years pass, reality often looks very different from the dream. Life brings stress, responsibilities, and unforeseen challenges, and slowly the gap between expectation and reality begins to widen. For many women, the disappointment isn't immediate. In the early years, they adjust, compromise, and tell themselves that things will get better. They assume that once the children are older, once the financial struggles ease, once the demands of daily life settle down, the relationship will improve. They hold on to the belief that their husband will one day become more attentive, more affectionate, more emotionally present. But what happens when that day never comes? What happens when they reach old age and realize that the changes they were waiting for will never happen? Unmet expectations take many forms. Some women expect their husband to be more romantic or emotionally available, only to find that he remains distant or unresponsive. Others expect more help with household responsibilities, only to end up carrying the burden alone for decades. Some hope for deeper conversations, shared interests, or a sense of adventure in their later years, but instead they feel stuck in a relationship that has become routine and uninspiring. The problem is not just that these expectations are unmet, It's that they were never acknowledged, never discussed, and never resolved. Over time, this silent disappointment turns into resentment. One of the biggest mistakes couples make is assuming that love means never having to ask for what you need. Many women believe that if their husband truly cared, he would just know what they want. They expect him to notice when they're feeling unappreciated or when they need more emotional support. But the truth is, most men do not operate this way. They're not mind readers, and without clear communication, they often don't realize the extent of their wife's dissatisfaction. Unfortunately, by the time these frustrations are voiced, they've often built up for so long that they explode in anger rather than conversation. And at that point, the husband may feel blindsided, wondering why his wife seems so unhappy when, from his perspective, everything seemed fine. Another painful reality of unmet expectations is the feeling of being taken for granted. Many women spend years prioritizing their husband's needs, supporting his career, managing the household, and raising children, all while sacrificing parts of themselves in the process. They assume that their efforts will be recognized and appreciated, but often they are not. As time goes on, they start to feel invisible, like their contributions are expected rather than valued. When a woman reaches old age and looks back at decades of self-sacrifice with little acknowledgement, the bitterness can be overwhelming. She may wonder why she gave so much to a relationship that gave her so little in return. The hardest part about unmet expectations is that don't always stem from malice. Most husbands don't set out to disappoint their wives. They simply assume that if nothing is being said, everything is fine. They don't always realize that their wife has been waiting for more affection, for deeper conversations, for shared experiences that never came. And by the time she expresses her frustration, the damage has already been done. In old age, when external distractions fade away, these disappointments become impossible to ignore. With the children gone and careers winding down, couples are left with only each other. For a woman who has spent years feeling unfulfilled, this realization can be devastating. She no longer has the distractions of raising a family or managing a household to keep her occupied. Instead, she is faced with the stark truth: the marriage she dreamed of never fully materialized, and now she's left with a relationship that feels more like a habit than a source of joy. Some women try to accept this reality, telling themselves that it's too late to expect anything different. But others reach a breaking point. They begin to pull away emotionally, focusing on themselves for the first time in years. They stop seeking validation from their husband and instead look for fulfillment elsewhere, through friendships, hobbies, or even solitude. And in some cases, they no longer feel the need to pretend. They allow their resentment to show, expressing their frustrations openly, sometimes even lashing out after years of suppressing their disappointment. The saddest part of this process is that it could have been prevented. Unmet expectations don't have to lead to resentment if they are addressed early on. If couples take the time to communicate, to express their needs, and to make adjustments before the damage is too great, they can prevent years of silent suffering. But too often, these conversations never happen. Instead, disappointment builds over time, turning love into frustration and companionship into obligation. By the time a woman reaches old age and realizes that her expectations were never met, the pain is no longer just about the marriage. It's about the life she feels she missed out on. And that kind of regret is one of the hardest things to live with. As women reach old age and reflect on their marriages, they often face a critical question. Is this relationship worth saving, or is it time to let go? After decades of shared history, responsibilities, and emotional investment, the idea of walking away, either physically or emotionally, can feel overwhelming. But for many women, the alternative is even more daunting: staying in a relationship that no longer brings them joy, connection, or fulfillment. The choice between rebuilding or letting go is not just about the marriage itself. It's about deciding what kind of life they want to live in their later years. For some, rebuilding is the path they choose. They recognize that resentment, emotional neglect, and unmet expectations have created distance, but they still see potential in the relationship. They believe that with effort, communication, and a renewed sense of commitment, the marriage can be salvaged. This often requires deep, honest conversations, ones that may have been avoided for years. These conversations are not easy, especially when they involve admitting pain, disappointment, or dissatisfaction. But for those willing to do the work, they can be transformative. Rebuilding a marriage in old age means both partners must be willing to change. The husband must acknowledge the ways in which he may have neglected his wife's emotional needs. And the wife must be open to expressing her feelings without allowing years of resentment to turn into blame. This process requires patience, vulnerability, and a genuine desire to reconnect. Some couples seek counseling or therapy to help navigate this journey, while others simply commit to spending more intentional time together, rediscovering the reasons they fell in love in the first place. For those who successfully rebuild, the later years of marriage can become some of the most meaningful, filled with a renewed appreciation for each other and a deeper emotional bond. But rebuilding is not always possible. Sometimes the damage is too deep and the emotional distance is too great to bridge. In these cases, women begin to detach, not always through divorce, but often through emotional withdrawal. They stop expecting things to change. They stop trying to engage in conversations that lead nowhere. They focus on themselves, their own happiness, their own sense of peace. This kind of emotional letting go is not always dramatic. Sometimes it happens quietly over time as a woman shifts her energy away from the marriage and toward her own fulfillment. Letting go does not always mean ending the marriage physically. Many women stay for practical reasons, financial security, family expectations, or simply the comfort of familiarity. But even within the marriage, they create a separate life for themselves. They prioritize friendships, hobbies, and personal growth in ways they never did before. They stop trying to fix what is broken and instead focus on what brings them joy. This can be empowering, giving them a sense of independence they may not have felt in years. For others, letting go does mean leaving. Some women, even in their later years, choose to end their marriages rather than spend the rest of their lives feeling unfulfilled. This decision is never easy, especially after decades of shared life. It requires immense courage to walk away from something that has been a defining part of one's identity. But for those who make this choice, it is often driven by the realization that they deserve to experience peace and happiness, even in the final chapters of their lives. Whether a woman chooses to rebuild or let go, the most important thing is that she makes a decision based on what is best for her well-being. Too often, women are conditioned to put their own happiness second, to sacrifice for the sake of stability or appearances. But old age brings a clarity that is impossible to ignore. There is no more time to wait for things to change. There is only the question of how they want to spend the rest of their years. Some marriages will heal and some will dissolve. But the ultimate goal is the same: to find peace, to let go of resentment, and to live a life that feels fulfilling. The journey to that place is different for everyone, but the destination, a sense of inner contentment, is what truly matters. In the end, the journey of a long-term marriage is not just about love. It's about growth, understanding, and the willingness to adapt. Women who find themselves resenting their husbands in old age are not simply bitter. They are awakening to the reality of emotional neglect, unmet expectations, and the silent distance that has grown over the years. Whether they choose to rebuild the relationship or let go emotionally, their decision is about reclaiming their happiness and self-worth. Marriage should not be a lifelong sacrifice of one's needs, nor should it be an obligation endured out of habit. The later years of life should be a time of peace, fulfillment, and connection. If a marriage can be healed, it's worth the effort. But if it cannot, then choosing oneself is not selfish. It is necessary. Because at the end of life, what matters most is not just love, but feeling truly seen and valued.